Well, 10 reasons why borders should be opened. Don't tell me. I know what you're thinking. Sounds pretty crazy, huh? Who's this guy? Haven't you read the news? Haven't you seen the attacks in Brussels 2 weeks ago? Opening the borders? Come on. We need to do exactly the opposite. We need to protect ourselves. We need to close the borders. Opening the borders? It's like the most stupid idea I've heard in ages. Well, if you think like that, let me reassure you. You're not the only one. And it's clearly understandable that in a time of crisis, when security is a threat, it seems only natural to be willing to close the border to protect yourself, especially when there are huge refugee flows at the borders of Europe. Yet tonight, I'd like to argue exactly the opposite. I'd like to argue that opening the borders is actually the most pragmatic, efficient, and rational thing to do to deal with the huge migration challenges of the 21st century. I want to argue that this is not a naive, idealistic utopia. Look at me. I'm a pretty regular guy. I'm not a rebellious activist. I've never thrown a stone at the riot police. If I were to use a cocktail Molotov, I would probably burn myself. And I consider myself as a pretty mainstream guy. And I argue that opening the border is not an idealistic idea, but a pragmatic solution that wouldn't make us any less secure, notwithstanding the fact that the terrorists who perpetrated the terrorist attacks in Belgium 2 weeks ago were all Belgians born in Belgium. So, here we go. Here are 10 reasons to open the borders. The first reason is a humanitarian reason. The war in Syria has been going on for 5 years. Syria is a country of about 22 million inhabitants. More than half of them have been displaced by the conflict. 6.6 million of them have been unable to escape the country and have been displaced within Syria. Close to 5 million of them have been able to flee in another country, most often in a neighboring country. So today, there are more than 1 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon. That's a tiny country. In Lebanon, 1 person out of 4 is a refugee. That's if Belgium had taken in 3 million refugees. In Jordan, there are close to 700,000 refugees. And in Turkey, there are 2.7 million refugees. The map is a bit old, but it looked fine on the screen, so I kept it. Turkey is not a country that hosts the largest number of refugees worldwide. And out of these 5 million refugees or so, a bit more than 1 million has attempted to reach Europe in the last few years. These are those who had enough money to pay thousands of euros to the smugglers. These are those who were brave enough to risk their life at sea. Why did they come by boat? They came by boat simply because they couldn't board a plane. And they couldn't take a plane because they had no visa. What we need to understand is the reason why we took a boat, the reason why they endured such a terrific journey is because the borders of Europe were closed. The result of that is that for the last 2 decades, more than 30,000 of them have died trying to reach the shores of Europe. Since the beginning of this year, more than 500 of them have died. And these are only the corpses that have been recovered. There are many, many, many more who have perished at sea and whose bodies will never be reclaimed. Europe has now become the world's most dangerous destination for migrants and refugees. And this is because they are forced to take boats, because they are forced to risk their lives, because for them, Europe is often the only exit door, because they refuse that their life, their studies, and their career stop in a refugee camp or in urban destitution in Turkey, Jordan, or Lebanon. We need to realize that people die because our borders are closed. If borders were open, people would be able to take a flight and to arrive safely to Europe. And this is the first reason why we should open the borders. The second reason is a pragmatic reason. A top priority of all governments nowadays is to fight the illegal smuggling of people. Migrant smuggling has now become the third largest illegal trafficking behind drugs and weapons. But the paradox is, migrants and refugees need smugglers. They need smugglers to cross the borders. That's the only way for them to cross a border. Without the smugglers, they wouldn't be able to do that. And yet, at the same time, they're also the victims of smugglers. As long as the borders will remain closed, the business of smugglers will continue to flourish. Because the migrants need them. And they're ready to do anything to close the borders, to cross the borders. Some of them would even be ready to hide in the engine of a car. We need to realize that every attempt to fight the smugglers will be useless and vain as long as the borders will remain closed, as long as the migrants and refugees will need the smugglers to cross these borders. The third reason why we need to open the borders is simply because closing them is useless and inefficient. Actually, we have evidence of that right before our eyes. Europe is now experiencing its largest migration flow for decades. And yet, the external borders of Europe have never been so hermetic. When Europe decided to implement the Schengen Agreement, to open its internal borders, well, it didn't lead to massive migration flows to Northern or Western Europe. When countries from Central and Eastern Europe joined in, they did not just empty themselves up. Even though Romania is 6 times poorer than Sweden. That's not just the case in Europe, but also outside of Europe. The border between India and Nepal has been open since 1950. It has not led to massive migration flows between the two countries. The wall between the US and Mexico has not stopped migration from Mexico to the US. This migration flow is determined by the economic conditions in the US and the state of the labor market. A wall will never stop people from migrating. It will just make the migration more dangerous, more costly, and more deadly. And on the other hand, an open border will not make people travel, will not make people migrate. And yet, we continue to think that controlling borders is the way to control migration. In 1989, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we thought, never again. We will never again build a wall that will separate people from each other. And yet, since 1989, we've built about 30 walls separating people from each other because we continue to think that when we close a border, we will stop people from coming in our country. That's just not true. That's a fantasy. Walls will never stop people from migrating in the same way that open borders will never induce people to migrate. The fourth reason is an economic reason. If we were to free up access to labor markets, colleagues from the University of Liège, in a paper recently published in the Scandinavian Journal of Economics, estimate that this would add about 12% to the world's GDP. We're completely irrational when we think about migration. Just look at this graph. In Europe, Hungary is the country with the most declining population. It is also a country where a whopping 55% of companies declare that they have difficulties in recruiting local workforce. From a rational economic point of view, which is the European country that needs migrants the most? Hungary. Which is the European country that wants migrants the least? Hungary. We're walking on our heads. The fifth reason is also a pragmatic reason. It is just to fight against illegal migration. That seems to be the top priority of all governments at the moment. We need to stop illegal migration. Well, if we were to open the borders, then all migration would become legal automatically. You think this is too easy? Well, this would also be the way to recognize the legitimacy of all migration projects. Because after all, who are we to decide that someone is more legitimate than someone else? That wouldn't make us any less secure. Because opening the borders is not eliminating the borders. We would still be able to check who comes in and who comes out. And that would make us easier to actually spot the potential terrorists or criminals. Because migration would be more orderly, more organized. And there is a final point to consider. At the moment, there are many undocumented migrants who have not visited their families for years, who have not seen their children, their spouses, or their parents or friends for years and years. Because they know that if they get out of Europe, they might never come back. So opening the borders would also allow all of these undocumented workers and people to see their friends and families. And surprisingly, the immediate result, the immediate consequence of the opening of the borders might be a decrease of immigration in Europe rather than an increase. The sixth reason is a social reason. Sometimes the opening of the borders is seen as a neoliberal project promoted by the rich and the powerful that would lead to a collapse of our social security system. That is just not true. Actually, that's quite the opposite. What the rich and powerful are interested in is cheap labor. And illegal migration means cheap labor. By making all migration legal, we would also eliminate the possibility for people to work under the minimum wages and without social protection. And this is why opening the borders is also the condition of a social progress. Reason number 7 is a financial reason. Closed borders are a huge waste of money. Since 2000, the European Union has spent 13 billion euros closing its external borders. And since that same date, migrants and refugees have spent 15 billion euros crossing that border. All in all, that's 28 billion euros that have been wasted and that could have been saved. Let me finish with 3 ethical reasons. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights recognizes that every human being has the right to leave a country, including one's own. That's the Article 13 of the Declaration. But this article has never been implemented because of the closed borders. What's the point of leaving a country if you cannot enter another country, huh? Well, by opening the borders, we would actually recognize and implement the fact that migration is a fundamental human right. And this is why opening the borders is first and foremost a project of liberty. Then, it seems to me that there is a fundamental injustice in the fact that the fate of one individual can be determined by the place where he or she was born. Today, there are some people who can travel pretty much anywhere without any difficulties, to Panama, to the Virgin Islands. And then, there are people who can virtually travel nowhere, who are stuck at home. And we have fought to abolish the privileges of birth. The privileges of birth used to relate to the social class you were born in. Today, they're more about the country you were born in. And it seems to me like a fundamental injustice that the fate of the people would be determined by the country they were born in, by their nationality. And this is why opening the borders is also a project of equality. Finally, reason number 10 is because we seem to be stuck in what I call a paradigm of immobility. We seem to think that in an ideal world, migration would not exist. People would stay put. We think and we speak of migration crisis, of a migration problem. We have not yet recognized that migration was a fundamental, structural phenomenon of a globalized world. And we continue to think of borders as a way to separate between us and them, as if there were not one humanity, but just an addition of us and them. And this is why borders are also symbolic objects that separate between us and them. And this is why opening the borders would also be a way to recognize the common and cosmopolitan destiny of humanity. This is why it would also be a project of fraternity. Thank you.